mic working okay? Everyone can hear me? Excellent. Thank you all very much for coming to our last IOP lecture of the calendar year. Yes, as Dan said, my name is Emma and I work here at the university. I have a few different jobs. I teach some undergrads. I help run our outreach and public engagement program across the whole school. And in between all of that, I'm also an astrophysicist. And in particular, I'm a galactic archaeologist. And that is what I would like to talk to you about tonight. The structure of the talk is kind of in two halves, so there will be a point in the middle to ask some questions, but if you have something that you want to ask while I'm going along, please do feel free to wave and shout. I can't absolutely guarantee that I'll notice you, but I'll try my best. So, galactic archaeology is kind of a newish field. It's concerned with studying the formation and evolution of our galaxy, which is the Milky Way. So this is an artist's impression of what we think the Milky Way looked like, or what we thought it looked like maybe about 10 years ago. It shows what's probably quite a familiar shape to many of you. So we have some sort of bluish coloured spiral arms and a yellowy extended blob thing in the middle. But this is only an artist's impression, right? We can't send a spacecraft far enough away that we could zoom out far enough to take a picture of our galaxy like this for ourselves. So we get this picture by analysing data that we have found about our Milky Way, but also making comparisons to other galaxies. But to understand how difficult it is to come up with this picture, try to imagine being asked to draw a picture of a building if you've only been inside one room, right? We're stuck inside the Milky Way. We can only see clearly our quite local environment. So understanding how the Milky Way looks like now is a really big challenge. And this is our immediate environment in space, right? So you'd think this is something we'd have figured out, but I'm afraid we don't so much. And in galactic archaeology, we want to make this even harder. We don't just want to know what the Milky Way looks like today, but we want to understand how it's changed over time. We're interested in its formation and evolution. And in this talk, I will try to explain to you how we can figure some things out and what stuff we still don't know. We do know some things, so we know that the sun is about halfway between the middle and the edge of the galaxy, sitting in one of these blue spiral arms. We know that the galaxy is about 100,000 light years across, and we know that it contains somewhere in the region of 100 billion stars. So that's one with 11 zeros after it, if you're wondering. And some of these stars are very much like the sun, and some of them are not at all like the sun. And these are the things that, as galactic archaeologists, these stars are the things that we care about. If you look back far enough, you can kind of figure out that galactic archaeology sort of started with this guy. This is Galileo Galilei. And he said in 1610 that the galaxy is nothing else but a mass of innumerable stars planted together in clusters. And Galileo, it turns out, is one of those really annoying people who is always right, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Because in 1610, they had no idea what a galaxy was. There was no concept of a galaxy as being something that is kind of isolated in space, or that there might be other galaxies, or that it has any kind of structure. But if you're a galactic archaeologist, Galileo is basically right, and it's only the stars that we care about. So there are other things in a galaxy. There's some gas, there's some dust, there might be a black hole or two. Almost all of the 100 billion stars probably has at least one planet, but as far as I'm concerned, they're just slimy rocks, and I'm not interested in them. We only care about the stars, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So, if we want to study our galaxy, galactic archaeology, the history of the Milky Way, we're using stars. What do we need to know about stars in order to be able to do this? We can break it down into three categories. We want to know where the stars are and how they're moving. We want to know what the stars are made of, and we want some concept of time. So we want to know when the stars were born. Stellar ages act as our clock. So in the first half of this talk, I will talk you through how we get information about each of these three categories. We'll take a little break in case there are any questions, and then I'll show you how we can put it all together and figure some things out about the galaxy at the end. So, to take the first one, where are the stars? Well, if we want to figure that out, what we really need to do is make a map. So this is the first map of the Milky Way, or the first proper map of the Milky Way, which was made by Caroline and William Herschel in 1785. And they did this by taking their telescopes and counting how many stars they could see from Earth looking out in different directions, and drawing them into this shape. And in order to make this shape, you have to make a lot of assumptions. So for example, they assume that the sun is somewhere near the middle of the galaxy. So this is where they said the sun was. And then you can see that as you look out from our position around the sun in different directions, this is how many stars they thought they could see. And by using the brightness of the stars, they would try to work out how far away they thought they were. And that's how you come up with the shape. But there are a lot of assumptions in here. In particular, they had no real concept of interstellar dust. And that's one of the things that contributes to the weird shape that you get around the edge. But they did get some things right. They were able to figure out that the galaxy has a kind of flattish shape. So even in 1785, we knew that the galaxy had a sort of structure, and we got that by studying stars. This is the most recent map of the galaxy, and this time this picture is real data, not an artist's impression. And if you want to come and look at it close up on my computer screen later, you can do. The detail here is just absolutely incredible. So to understand this image, we have a spacecraft which is looking out into the galaxy, and over here we have the middle of the galaxy, and these edges wrap around, and then from here you kind of wrap behind your head, if you like, and you come back onto this side. So we're looking all through the galaxy. And here we can see some structure and some dust. So the main structures that we can see will give you an indication of the level of imagination that astronomers normally have when they're naming things. So there's a big bulgy thing in the middle. That's called the bulge. There's a sort of flat, roundish shape that extends on both sides. The thin bit in the middle is called the thin disk, and the slightly puffier bit around the edge is called the thick disk. And around all of this, there's a much less dense sphere of stars, and that's called the stellar halo. So those are the four main components of the galaxy that we need to understand, and they are made of stars. And then the stuff that you see in the way here, that's the dust that got in the way of the Herschel's map of the galaxy. So we can make a picture like this, and when we do this, we're doing something called astrometry. And astrometry is a kind of word that means mapping the stars, and it's probably the oldest bit of astronomy. So we're using the oldest tool in astronomy to do one of the newest things in astronomy, which is galactic archaeology, which I kind of like. So how do we get this data? Well, we use a spacecraft called Gaia. This is Gaia down here, which was a European Space Agency mission. It started observing in June 2014, and it finished its observing run in January this year. So we have something like 10.5 years of data. And Gaia is shaped kind of like a spinning top, and for those 10.5 years, it's been rolling through the galaxy, scanning the stars, and making measurements of position. And the precision here is unbelievable. So Gaia is so precise that if you put it on Earth, it would be able to see a pound coin on the surface of the moon. This image is not to scale. That's quite an impressive feat. So it's probably the most powerful camera that's been put into space. It has something like 1 billion pixels across 106 CCDs. It can see things that are 1,000 times fainter than your eye can. It's a pretty incredible instrument. Everybody was very sad when it finally ran out of coolant earlier in the year. But don't worry, all the results that I'm talking about use data that was released during the course of my PhD, and that only covers the observing run up to something like 2017. It won't be till 2030 that we actually get all of the data from the 10.5 years. So everything I show you here that is based on Gaia is already, I hope you all agree, interesting and impressive, but there's still a lot more data that we already have from the telescope that hasn't been analyzed yet. So it's kind of easy enough to understand how we can map the positions of stars relative to each other, right? You can imagine taking a picture and saying, well, this one is on the top left and that one is on the bottom right. That's easy enough. But how can we get an idea of distance? We need to have a 3D picture of our galaxy if we're going to understand it. And Gaia does this by doing something called a parallax measurement. So this is the first interactive element of the talk. Everybody can stick their arm out in front of them like this. Try to put something in the background, maybe put the slides in the background, okay? And then you close one eye, and then you close the other eye, and I stand here and laugh at you looking very silly, but you hopefully notice that something is happening to your finger when you close one eye and then the other. What happens to your finger? It appears to move from side to side, right? And now if you bend your elbow and bring your finger closer to your face, and you do it again, you might have to go back to the long version. What's different about the motion there? It moves more, right? Or it appears to move more. And this is the parallax effect. So what's happening here is you're viewing your finger through one eye, and then you change your point of measurement to the other side of your face, and you have a baseline, which is the width of your face. And Gaia does this by imaging a star in, say, June, when it's on one side of the Earth, and then imaging a star again in December or January, when it's on the other side of the Earth. So it has a baseline, which, when the Earth is on the other side of the sun, rather. So it has a baseline of 2 astronomical units as the sun goes round, as the Earth goes around the sun during the course of a year. So that means that we can see some motion. And here is a little animation. And what you will see here is an image of some stars, and in a minute, it's a bit motion sickness inducing, but you should be able to see that the foreground stars are moving in quite big circles, and then as you look a little bit longer, you can notice that the background stars are moving too, but the circles seem a little bit smaller, right? So if you were constantly imaging a star over the course of a year, you would see this kind of motion. I should say that this has been exaggerated by something like 100,000 times spatially and sped up, I think 1 trillion times to make this something that is easy to see. So the motion and it's very small and it's very slow, but we can get some kind of idea. But of course, stars are also moving in space. They're all moving around the galactic center. So on top of this circular motion that comes from our parallax measurement, we also have to know that the stars have a proper motion. They are actually moving in space relative to the Earth or the Sun or our spacecraft. So what you get in total is this kind of spiral movement over time. And what Gaia does is observes very small parts of the path of stars along these spirals, but with enough precision that we can reconstruct them. And by measuring the features of these spirals, we can understand how far away stars are, but also their motions around the center of the galaxy. So we make a map to know where the stars are, and we study their movement over time. We make a model of it to know how they're moving. Everybody still with me? Just about. Excellent. So in the last 10 years, this has done a few things for us. Gaia has observed more than 1 billion stars, which is quite impressive, but it's not even 1% of the stars that are in the galaxy. But even that has been enough to tell us that maybe we didn't know what the Milky Way looked like quite as well as we thought we did. So this is the picture that I showed you at the beginning, and this is a similar artist's impression but of what we think the Milky Way looks like now, based on the Gaia observations that have been analysed so far. So you can see that 10 years ago we thought there were 2 very strong, very prominent spiral arms. Now it seems like the distribution of stars is a bit more even, and we have more spiral arms, but that they're more even in size. And also this is the bar that surrounds the bulge in the galaxy. It seems like that's in a slightly different orientation than we thought it was 10 years ago. So even off the first few years of Gaia data, even having observed just 1% of stars in the galaxy, the precision allows us to draw conclusions which really fundamentally change what we think about the Milky Way. Okay, so we're just about there with where stars are and how they're moving. The next thing I said that we need to know is what stars are made of. And to figure this out, we use a tool called spectroscopy to study the elements in stars. And spectroscopy is a word that might be familiar to you if you're doing GCSEs or A-levels in science or physics or chemistry. And it's a way of working out what colors are inside light and using that to work out what elements are inside material that the light has passed through. So the basic system is that we take the light from our star and we stick it through our telescope on the ground or in space. And inside our telescope, we have a tool called a spectroscope, which you can think of as a fancy glass prism. And this splits the light into the different colors of the spectrum. And when we look at stars, what we find is that some of those colors are missing. And we find a pattern of black lines, a little bit like a barcode, in this spectrum. And this can tell us something about the elements which are present in the outer layers of the star, like the star's atmosphere. So this is what it looks like for the sun. Where we have a much greater level of detail than we do for other stars. And you see the color change here from red to blue as we move up in frequency or down in wavelength through the electromagnetic spectrum. And you see the black lines here which show which specific colors or frequencies of light have been absorbed. And the position of these lines tell us in quite a lot of detail about elements which are present in the outer layers of the sun. And more than that, we can work out how much of an element is there based on the thickness or the amount of the line. And we can also tell things about how stuff is moving, or the temperature, or the density, or surface gravity, all from looking at this picture. But to do this, we need to be able to compare to laboratory results. So we have in a lab some gas where we know what's in the gas, and we do experiments with it to work out what frequencies we would expect to be taken out of the full spectrum. And then when we put it all together and make a comparison to a star, we can say, well, this star has some oxygen, or it has some magnesium, or something like that. So why does this actually help us? Well, you might know that stars shine because they fuse hydrogen to helium in their cores. But the key thing about that is that it happens in the core, in the middle of the star, and it doesn't actually change very much what the star is made of in its outer layers. And what that means is that the star doesn't change over time on its outside. So when we look at the star in a spectroscopic way, we are seeing the same thing no matter how evolved the star is. There are a few exceptions, but in general, this is a good rule. You might also know that stars form from the collapse of clouds of gas. So that means that if we see what a star is made of in its outer layers, what we're actually seeing is what was in the cloud of gas that formed the star in the first place. And what was in that cloud of gas? Well, that's the stuff that the galaxy was made of at the time and in the place that the star was born. So if we can spectroscopically analyze stars with information about where they are and with information about how old they are, which we're coming to in a minute, we can work out the material that made up the Milky Way over the past. This is nice, and we can build up an understanding of how much magnesium or iron or calcium there might be. But it gets even more interesting when we think about the fact that this changes over time. So there's an idea of Big Bang nucleosynthesis, right? This is a phrase that you might be familiar with, but basically what it means is that the universe was formed with a fairly even distribution of just a few elements. So mostly hydrogen, some helium, and a little bit of everything else, right? That means that if we see other elements in the universe today, they must have come from somewhere. And the place that they come from is stars. All kinds of different processes of nuclear fusion inside the star during its lifetime, but also when a star dies, all of the material that is made in the star is released back into the interstellar medium, into the material that makes up our galaxy. So for low-mass stars, where they form a white dwarf and then their outer layers blow away as a planetary nebula, elements which are formed by fusion during their lifetime get gently blown off into space. For more massive stars that might die as a supernova, elements are ejected violently, and these are such energetic events that they can also produce new elements in themselves. And there's a lot of very interesting research about chemical nucleosynthesis and how chemicals build up in galaxies over time. But the key point is that the stars make some elements, and then they release them back into space, and then that stuff forms the material from which the next generation of stars are born. So the chemicals build up over time, changing their distributions throughout the galaxy. Okay, our last dimension is time, and what we're interested in here is how old the stars are. So this is a picture of the sun today, not today, now-ish, and at the moment it's a main sequence star. And in 4.5 billion years, it will be a red giant star. This is a picture of a red giant, and what I have definitely not done is just made the first picture bigger and redder. Right. So this is roughly what a red giant will look like. So this is the sun when it's much more evolved. And at the moment, the sun is fusing hydrogen into helium in its core, like we just discussed. But at some point, the hydrogen in the middle of the star is going to run out. And at that point, hydrogen will start to fuse into helium in a shell around the core, and there'll be a big blob of hot helium sitting in the middle of the star doing nothing. And we call this the inert helium core. And during this process, while the shell burning is going on, the outer layers of the sun get puffier and puffier and puffier, and they look redder as they cool down, but they also, the star as a whole also becomes much brighter. And for that reason, these red giant stars are really useful for galactic archaeologists, because we can see them over much greater distances than we can see main sequence stars like the sun, because they're much brighter. But the key piece of information is that this main sequence phase of a star's life, the time where it's fusing hydrogen into helium, is the longest bit, right? The sun is about halfway through its at the moment, and it's 4.5 billion years old. So the sun will be doing this for 9 or 10 billion years. And once it gets to its red giant phase, if we could observe the star as a red giant, we would know that the age of the red giant star is basically the same as whatever its main sequence lifetime is, right? Because the main sequence lifetime is the thing that takes the most time in the life of a star. So if you observe a star that has passed it, if you can work out the main sequence lifetime, you can work out the age. So how do we work out a main sequence lifetime? Well, the key fact here is that more massive stars live fast, die young. They have more material to fuse, there's more hydrogen there to fuse, to burn, to shine, but they get through it much more quickly because the fusion processes are more efficient. So that means that if we can work out how massive a star is, we can work out how long its main sequence lifetime is, and therefore we can work out how old it is. Everyone still with me? Good, nodding, excellent. So next question, how can we work out how massive a star is? Well, we can do this with a technique called astroseismology. This is a picture of the surface of the sun, a much closer up picture than we saw before. And each one of these sort of funny shapes here, these are called convection cells. Each one of these is somewhere about the size of Texas, just to give you an idea. This is an incredibly high resolution image of the sun. And what's happening here is that hot material on the surface of the sun is rising and cool material is falling back down. So think of this like the surface of a pan of boiling water. Stuff is moving around, right? And when your kettle boils or when your pan boils, it makes a noise, right? You can hear something. So as this material rises and falls, it makes a lot of noise. And some of these specific frequencies of this noise can get trapped inside the star and it can resonate. So I'm not sure how well you'll be able to hear this at the back. This is supposed to be a demonstration to show how sounds can get trapped in funny shaped objects. It's not a perfect analogy for a star, because to my knowledge, nobody has found a star that is a like bendy plastic tube yet, but we'll see. So if I spin this, and then if I spin it faster, can you see how you can just about hear it? There are a few here, so if you promise not to hit each other with them, you can come and play with them at the end of the talk. So the idea here is to show that in a particular shape, we can trap different frequencies of sound. So the way to think of that is that there are different notes trapped inside a star. Okay, this is not a documentary. However, it did get one thing right. In space, no one can hear you scream, and that also means you can't hear sounds which are trapped inside stars. So how can we get this information out about what frequencies are trapped inside the star? This is a video of a speaker cone, right? And in order to produce sound, the speaker cone vibrates backwards and forwards, and the effect that has is to compress and rarefy the particles in the air. And the same thing is happening in reverse as you hopefully listen to me, in that your eardrum is moving, right, as the air between us is compressed and stretched out. This is what happens inside a star with these trapped frequencies, these trapped sound waves, except a star has no solid surface. So what that means is that when these waves get to the surface of the star can contract a little bit or expand a little bit, either altogether or in small patches. And when it contracts, it gets a bit brighter, and when it expands, it gets a bit dimmer. So this means that if we can observe the brightness of the star and how it changes over time, we can gradually work out what frequencies are in the star. If we can work out what frequencies are in the star, we can work out how massive the star is. And if we can work out how massive the star is, we can work out how old the star is. It's quite a long chain, and there's a lot of maths that goes in between all of these steps as well. So the frequency spectrum looks something like this, where on the horizontal, the x-axis, we have pitch going up. So this is effectively the note that is trapped inside the star. And on the y-axis going up, we have power, or you can think of this as volume, how much of each frequency is trapped. And you can see there's a lot going on. It's quite spiky, but there are a few quite clear comb-like straight lines here, right? And these are the characteristic resonant frequencies which get trapped inside a star. And if we can look at a spectrum like this, we can do a few things. So we can characterize where the middle of this kind of bump is. And this red line shows you roughly where that is. And the middle position of this bump tells us something about how big and how massive the star is. So think of this as if I rang a small bell, you would expect a high pitch. And if I rang a big bell, you would expect a low pitch, right? There are a lot more things we can do with this, though. So here I have a big metal bell. And if I hit it, it rings like a bell, right? But I can do something to this bell. I can spin it round. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to hit the bell, and then I'm going to spin it. And I want you to try and listen and see if you can hear a difference in the sound. Anybody hear anything? Maybe with your hand you could show me what you're hearing. Somebody's wobbling their hand over here. Can you sort of hear a kind of wobbly sound? It may be easier at the front of the room. So again, we can have a go after the talk. So the idea here is that this bell is rotating, right? And as the sound waves travel around the bell, Some of them are moving in the same direction as the rotation of the bell. They get pushed along, they get sped up a little bit, and their frequency goes up a little bit. And some of them are moving against the direction of rotation of the bell, so they get dragged back, slowed down a little bit, and their frequency goes down a little bit. And that creates an effect which is called beating. And if you've ever heard, I don't know, 6-year-olds playing the violin, slightly out of tune, it's that effect. It's that kind of wobbly sound that you hear. And we can actually use this effect with these kinds of frequencies, because if instead of one line here we saw 2 or maybe 3, this would tell us something about how fast a star is rotating. And this doesn't just mean at the surface, we can also work out rotation speeds at different depths inside the star. So we don't have much time to talk about astroseismology tonight, but it's an incredibly varied and powerful tool for seeing inside a star in a way that no other technique allows us to. And to make an analogy, think of it like in Earth seismology, where you have earthquake waves, and measuring these waves at the surface is the thing that allows us to understand the Earth has a core and a mantle and a crust. This is a similar technique. And I'm going to switch to show, hopefully, a live view. I would like, yes, there we go. And these are some sounds of stars. Oh, no. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to stop talking in a minute, and then I'm going to turn the sound up, and I'll hold the microphone close to the speakers of the laptop, and I'll hover my mouse over a few different stars, and you can see on the side the size of the stars. It lights up as I hover the mouse over it. And what you'll hear is the sound, the frequencies of each of the stars. So that's the best one. Okay. So when we put this information together, we can use broadly the pitch to help us understand mass and size of stars, but also much more detailed information. This all helps us to model the star in a lot of detail, and that helps us to get a really good handle on the mass and therefore the age of the star. There are other ways to do this, but astroseismology is the way that gives us the most precision with age, and that's really important. Okay, so we've just about reached the halfway mark, more or less on time. To wrap up what we've seen so far, we know now that in order to study the Milky Way's formation, evolution, we need to know 3 things about the stars that are in it today. We need to know where they are and how they're moving. We need to know what they're made of, and we need to know when they were born. And we get the where information by using astrometry to make a map of the star and by revisiting observations of stars to see how they're moving over time. And we get the what information by using spectroscopy to study elements in the outer layers of stars, which tells us what the universe, what the galaxy was made of at the time and in the place that the star was born. And we use astroseismology to model stars in a lot of detail to get an idea of mass and therefore an idea of their age. All right. Now we're going to try and put it all together and figure out some things that we can learn about the Milky Way. So one thing that we observe about our galaxy today is that there are more stars containing more heavy elements in the middle of the galaxy than there are on the edge, right? So if we were to make a plot of the amount of heavy elements in stars, and we were going to plot that against their position from the middle of the galaxy out towards the edge, we see some kind of downward slope like this. Right? And to show you this in real data, this is some data from my PhD. Each one of these black points is a star in the Milky Way. And on this axis, I'm plotting this thing which is Fe/h. So this is the amount of iron in the star compared to the amount of hydrogen in the star. And it's written with these square brackets because we do a special logarithmic process to make the comparison. And if you've seen this written down before, you might have seen it called the metallicity. Iron is actually a metal. Astronomers are incredibly lazy, though. As far as we're concerned, everything heavier than helium counts as a metal. So if you hear me say metallicity, it doesn't just mean iron or things that you might think of as a metal. It can also mean oxygen. To an astronomer, oxygen is a metal. Okay, so you see this metallicity, this amount of heavy elements plotted against how close to the middle of the galaxy the star is. So the middle of the galaxy is in this direction, and the outside of the galaxy is in this direction. And it doesn't look quite as clean as the nice orange line that I drew up here, but we can see a kind of downward trend in the data. So, putting our galactic archaeology hats on, what does this tell us? Well, the first question we have to think about is how do we get iron or heavy elements? How do we build up metallicity in the galaxy? Well, if we think back, we remember that each generation of stars enriches the universe and the galaxy around it. So each generation forms elements by fusing in the core, and when they die, they might produce even more elements with special supernova processes, which are even more energetic than the fusion in a stellar core. And that enriches the cloud of gas from which the next generation of stars form. So when the next generation forms, it has a higher percentage of these heavy elements at the point when it's born, and therefore we will see more of them when we do spectroscopy of this star. And then that one dies, and then we see the next one, and the next one, and the next one, right? So if we have more stars with more heavy elements in the middle of the galaxy, that means that we must have had more generations of stars in the middle of the galaxy in order to build up this population of elements, right? And that is how we know that the disk of the galaxy formed from the inside out. And this is an idea called inside-out formation of the galactic disk. So the idea is that stars started forming in the middle of the disk first, which means they die there first, which means the material in the middle of the disk is enriched earlier in more heavy elements. So when we look at stars which are towards the middle of the galactic disk today, we see higher fractions of heavy elements in more stars. And this is lovely, except it gets much more complicated than that. So if we take our population of stars now and we divide them according to how old they are. So this is the plot that I showed you before, and it turns out that all the stars here are somewhere between 2 and 4 gigayears old, so a little bit younger than the Sun. But I can also observe stars which are between 1 and 2 gigayears old, or stars that are less than 1 gigayear old. And if we do this, it can be a little bit difficult to interpret because the number of stars that we have in each of these groups of age differs. But you can see there's a green band drawn around the line in each of these plots. And this band characterizes how much spread around the main trend there is in this population. And what you hopefully will take away is that for the younger stars, this band is smaller, and for the older stars, this band is bigger. So, if all our stars were orbiting the middle of the galaxy on nice, reasonably circular orbits, then they should be born into the galaxy along this orange line, if we understand how chemicals are built up, right? Which means that if we see them spreading out further from this line more as they get older, it must mean that they migrate away from their birth radius over time. Okay? And this can happen for a few reasons. So stars' orbits are not necessarily perfectly circular. They can be a bit elliptical, which means at the point that we observe the star, it might happen to be a bit closer or a bit further away from the galactic center. There are some things we can do about this. So the radius that I'm plotting here, the position from the center of the galaxy, is not exactly where we observe the star. We do a calculation which removes the effect of the eccentricity of the orbit. So we shouldn't be looking at that, at least not too much in this plot. So what we're actually seeing is the fact that stars have interacted, not usually with each other, but sometimes with big structures in the galaxy, like the spiral arms or large gas clouds which are forming new stars, and they get a little push to their orbit, and it shifts the whole orbit further in or further out from the galactic center over their lifetime, which makes looking at the galaxy today and trying to understand where everything came from a little bit confusing, because the radius that you see a star at now, its distance from the middle of the galaxy, is not the radius that it was born at. And we can also work out that the Sun was probably born a bit closer to the middle of the galaxy than it is today, because it's slightly too metal-rich for its current orbital position. Okay, this is kind of nice, but there's more dramatic stuff that we can do as well. So here we have a sequence of pictures of interacting galaxies. So what happens here is that we see these are mostly spiral galaxies, and gradually they get closer together. These are all different systems, right? This is not something we can watch happening in real time, although that would be much more exciting. But they've kind of ordered them to show you a little bit of the process of the galaxies passing and the gravitational attraction starting just to tug at the outer layers of the spiral, and then as they get too close, the spiral structure becoming disrupted. And here we have an active galaxy merger. And this is something that we see happening all over the place, right? We see the remnants of it because if two galaxies of quite similar size merge, then it disrupts significantly the spiral structure, and we end up with some blobby-looking thing at the end. But we also see interactions maybe more like this one, where we have one galaxy which is much more massive than the other. And in this case, what can happen is the stars from the smaller, the less massive galaxy, they can get absorbed or accreted into the larger, more massive galaxy. And although there are a lot of stars in a galaxy, like 100 billion or so. In something the size of the Milky Way, there's much more space between them than there is space taken up by the stars. So when you have this merger event, it is statistically almost impossible that any two stars are actually going to crash into each other or even directly gravitationally interact. So what happens is that the stars from the accreted smaller galaxy get spread out through the Milky Way today. And we can find them. So we can understand something about the chemicals and the patterns in the chemistry that we expect to find from big galaxies like the Milky Way compared to smaller dwarf galaxies, which, who knows, maybe the Milky Way ate during its past, right? That's what we're looking for. We know that we still have a spiral structure today, so we know that what we're looking for is things that are quite a lot less massive than the Milky Way. And the reason for these different chemical fingerprints is the fact that it turns out that bigger galaxies like the Milky Way have a different balance of more massive and less massive stars. And that means that chemistry builds up in a different way in those galaxies. So we can take all the stars, or some of the stars, that we can see in a galaxy and we can make a plot of it. And there's quite a lot going on here, so I'll try and go through it step by step. On this plot, we see how much magnesium is in a star compared to how much iron, and how much iron is in a star compared to how much hydrogen. So if you see a flat line, like this blue one, what that means is that we are increasing the amount of magnesium and iron inside the star in a steady way, in the same rate, right? The iron is building up compared to hydrogen, so we're moving from left to right, but the line isn't going up or down because magnesium is building up inside the star at the same rate. And then if we have a downward slope, in this case, it means that now we're producing more iron than we are magnesium, right? Because the amount of magnesium compared to iron is going down as we build up the iron quantities. So again, each point in this plot is a star in the galaxy, and we characterize, or in the galaxy today, and we characterize its chemistry. And we know something about where we expect magnesium and iron to be formed, at least the dominant channels. So magnesium and iron are both formed by type 2 supernovae. And type 2 supernovae are the end remnants of very massive stars. And if you think back 20 minutes ago, we found out that massive stars live fast and die young, right? And that means that almost immediately, once you start forming stars in a galaxy, you start having type 2 supernovae, because they don't take, there's no gap between starting to form stars and some of the more massive ones dying off. And that means that very early on in a galaxy's history, we produce magnesium and iron, but in a kind of steady way, because we only have one formation channel that really matters for these two elements. Then at some point, we introduce another kind of supernova, and that's a type 1a supernova. And this is the one, you might have heard of it, where you have, for example, a white dwarf and a red giant star, and they're orbiting each other, and the white dwarf is accreting, stealing material from the red giant star until it reaches some critical mass, and then there is a supernova. And these are really useful tools because they have a reasonably standard brightness. They allow us to measure distances over very large regions of space, but importantly for us, they produce iron, but they don't produce very much magnesium. So that means that when you have type 1a supernovae starting up in your galaxy, you're now producing more iron than you are magnesium, right? The type 2 supernovae are still going, but they're producing both magnesium and iron, and these guys are only producing iron. So this is where the downward slope comes from. Okay, so far so good. Why do we see this happen as the iron builds up? Well, this is a kind of neat way of using the chemistry as a sort of clock, getting an idea of chronology from the way the elements build up. And the reason for that is that the type 1a supernova, they can't start happening until you have some white dwarfs, right, to be going around red giant branch stars. And white dwarfs come from the endpoints of low mass stars, and low mass stars live much longer. So that means that there's a delay where we have the deaths of massive stars producing magnesium and iron, and then at this point, some characteristic time later, we have less massive stars starting to die as type 1a supernova and producing iron. Okay, that means that the exact position of this line, height-wise, how much magnesium we have compared to iron, and the position of this knee and the angle of this slope, all of that is extremely dependent on exactly how many high massive and how many high mass and how many low mass stars you have in your galaxy, or rather the balance between them. And that changes depending on whether you're a big galaxy like the Milky Way or a small one like a small satellite galaxy, right? So this data is for the Milky Way. And This line, blue line, and the orange line indicates the elements that we would expect to find in the Milky Way. There's a separate bit down here, which is to do with the thin disk, which we don't have time to talk about, but this part, and this blob at the bottom, those are all stars that we expect to find in the Milky Way, given what we know about how massive the galaxy is and the balance of different kinds of stars. So the question is, what are these guys? Right? These guys, they don't fit into our picture of how chemistry happens in the Milky Way. And it turns out that those guys come from much smaller galaxies, which were accreted into the Milky Way over its history. And we can go further than this. So far, we've only used the chemistry. If we add in information about how stars orbit the galactic center, we can start to group together stars with odd chemistry, and we find that they all have similar orbital properties. So what you're looking at here is a measure of how energetic the orbit is, and a measure of which direction around the galactic center the stars are going. And you see a big blob here on the side. That's the galactic disk, right? That's a lot of stars in the Milky Way all going around in the same direction. And this blob in the middle is the galactic halo, because that's fairly agnostic for the main direction of rotation in the galaxy. But if we take stars with similar chemistry and we plot them and we color them in, then we can see that we see shapes which have been given extremely odd names by astronomers who should know better. And the chemistry and the kinematics, this information about how the orbits change together, really indicates to us that these stars came from one galaxy, or at least one part of one accreted galaxy. And these yellow ones over here, they came from somewhere else altogether. And these orange ones, they're a third one at least. So you take all of that and you think, the Milky Way has accreted quite a lot of galaxies over the past. And then, if you can work out how old the stars in those little populations are, then you can build up a kind of family tree, or the Lego instruction book, if you like, of how to build the Milky Way. And this is extremely tentative. There's a lot of very active debate. But there are a few quite big structures which we think the Milky Way must have accreted, and we can make some tentative judgment about which ones happened first and which ones happened afterwards. This, Gaia Enceladus, is one that you may possibly have seen in the news a few years ago when the announcement was made. This one is quite a significant chunk of the Milky Way, a fairly large percentage of stars in the galactic halo. And it was such a catastrophic event when it happened that this is probably the merger that created the thick disk as we see it today. That we had a thin disk of stars, and when the merger happened, they all got a kick to their orbits, and it made the whole disk a bit fluffier, and now there's a new thin disk forming in between. So this is a bit more, take it with a pinch of salt. But we do know that the Milky Way is an extremely hungry galaxy and has eaten many, many small galaxies over its history. And we're not done yet. This is an artist's impression of what the sky will look like in something like 4 or 5 billion years, when the Milky Way starts to get a little bit too close to the Andromeda Galaxy. And that will be our next major merger. But we probably won't be around to see that one. So, thank you very much.